Welcome back. I hope the midterm exam went well. So far, we've worked our way up to a model of the labor market equilibrium. That's what we've covered so far in both the chapters and on the midterm exam that you guys just took. And through this, we understood the basics of how supply and demand interact to reach an equilibrium. Now, this is a great model that provides a lot of important insights, but as I'm sure you've already noticed, it's not perfectly realistic. We talked about models very early on, where we have to simplify away from the real world, and we've done that quite a bit so far. Now, in the second half of the course, we're going to continue working with the model of supply and demand, but in a lot of these chapters, we're going to be adding more wrinkles to make our analysis more accurate and more realistic to the world that we live in. And so we can look at how different changes in the labor market or different characteristics of jobs can change what we expect the equilibrium outcome to be for the labor market. So to start this out, we're going to begin by talking about compensating wage differentials, or the differences in wages between jobs that are a result of the different characteristics of those jobs. Now, when we talk about equilibrium, we say that the free entry and exit of a large number of firms and workers lead to a single equilibrium wage. But this isn't quite true in practice. It leads to a single equilibrium wage if all the jobs are alike. Workers have to be indifferent between jobs, and firms have to be indifferent between workers. But that isn't entirely accurate. You work in HR, so you know that not every single worker that submits a resume, or potential worker that submits a resume, is going to be exactly the same. You're not indifferent between them. That's why we have people work in hiring committees. Jobs also differ substantially in expectations. There are a lot of different roles within a firm, and jobs tend to have different duties, commute times, skills required. Offices have different coworkers, there's different company culture, different risk of injury, temperature in the building, work hours, the views you receive. I could go on for hours about all the little differences that add up and that workers really care about. The idea of compensating wage differentials is old. It dates back to Adam Smith in 1776. I think I alluded to this concept earlier with the movement towards equilibrium between two labor markets. You have to consider the whole of advantages and disadvantages in Adam Smith's words. That you can't just think about all jobs being the same, that there are particulars to each job that you have to consider. So think about your own life. When you were thinking about getting your first job out of school or looking for a new job to switch things up later, did you only consider the wages like workers have so far in the simple model that we've been working with? No. We also consider how well we fit within the company, where it's located, and plenty of other things. Often, economists and non-economists alike think of costs far too narrowly, just looking at the dollars and cents that we can add up. But I'm certain that more than one of you left the job because of an annoying or impossible coworker or boss. Now, no one may have charged you $10,000 per year just to deal with them, but it certainly felt like a cost and a negative thing factoring into your everyday life, and that ended up playing into your decision to leave. Think of what it would be like to put up with Michael Scott in the early seasons of The Office every single day. Probably more than what it would take to work with a better boss. Think of how many pro athletes will take a pay cut to play for a great coach, or how many actors will take a pay cut to work with a great director. Some people will give up money for a good commute. When I moved to West Virginia, to WVU, my commute time went from 30 minutes down to 5. Even though my old commute was relatively easy on backcountry roads, and there wasn't much traffic besides the occasional work tractor that you got stuck behind, it felt so much better going down to a 5-minute commute. It would take a lot more to get me to go back and do a 30-minute commute again. So these other characteristics of the jobs really do matter. Now, I mentioned my old summer job at the furniture factory a lot in this course. Partially it's because it's so different from academia, partially because it provides some really good examples for different topics that we talk about. So unlike sitting at my desk in Reynolds Hall or my home office, there was some risk involved in loading trucks with furniture. My friend Wesley stepped on some trash left over in a trailer, ended up getting a nail in his foot, so he had to leave work and get a tetanus shot. Those trailers could get up to over 100 degrees in the summer sun, and if you were climbing on top of furniture to load something in there, at like the very top to fill up all the room, if you accidentally pressed your back or your skin up against the top, you would really feel it. We had to wear safety glasses throughout the plane at all times. And if we were on a stack of furniture over our chest height, we had to wear harnesses and hook up to a piece of equipment. Because because the summer before I started, someone actually fell off one of those really high stacks, like 30 or 40 feet, ended up having to leave the job because of the injury. So we can begin by considering just two types of jobs, a risky job like that, or in this case, an even riskier job where injury is basically guaranteed. So let's compare these. Risky job, again, where over time it's guaranteed that you're going to get some sort of injury, and completely safe jobs that are the exact opposite, where there's no chance of injury. They're guaranteed to be safe. Now, let's suppose that each worker knows the risk of going into this up front, so they can choose their career with full knowledge. They know whether the job is safe or whether it's risky. So the risky job is something like a heavyweight boxer. This is a pretty realistic assumption. You know, if you get in the ring against Mike Tyson in the 90s, you're going to get hurt. That's not always the case. Back until the 1960s, people didn't know that asbestos was bad for you. We're going to assume that in this case, the risky jobs are like getting in the ring with Mike Tyson. You know you're going to get hurt, just to make things simpler. So before, our workers only cared about wages, but now they care about two things. They care about wages and their safety. So the worker's utility function is a function of their wages and the risk of injury. Those are their two considerations. Now, the marginal utility of income is the additional utility that the worker receives from a $1 increase in the wage, holding the risk of injury constant. In this case, we're only concerned about what happens when the wage increases. We assume that the worker prefers more money to less money, which is a realistic assumption. So the marginal utility of income is positive, just like it was before. We say that because the marginal utility of risk is negative, so it's important to point that out. So the marginal utility of risk being negative means that holding income constant, the risk of injury as that increases or the job becomes more risky, the marginal utility is going to decrease. The workers are less happy or less satisfied. So in this case, when the marginal utility of risk is negative, that means that workers prefer safety to the risk of harm. This is a fairly good assumption. So here we see a set of workers and difference curves for our model, which now includes the risk of injury. Again, injuries are bad in our model, so wages have to increase in order to make up for the added risk and to make that worthwhile for the worker. Here, the x-axis, shows the probability of injury or the risk. And again, there's only two types of jobs. So there is 0, perfectly safe, and 1, guaranteed risky. And the y-axis shows the wages that the worker earns. So the indifference curves are going to slope upwards. That means that wages have to rise to account for the added risk. So let's suppose a worker starts out here at point P on this indifference curve U0. The only way that you could get the worker to switch from the safe job to the risky job over here is if you increase their wages. And you have to increase the wages all the way up to where this indifference curve crosses that 1 for the probability of injury. So that's a wage W hat 1, called a little up thing over the W hat. So this worker would not choose to keep the same wage and move to the riskier job in this model. So if they're at W0 here, and you try to entice them to leave that job, to take a risky job and offer them that wage down here, there's no way they'd be willing to take it. To get them to be indifferent, you would have to have this higher wage way up here at W1. Now, we have 3 different indifference curves on this graph. So this gives us a good chance to show that it's possible for the worker to increase their utility. So if they move from this indifference curve here to this indifference curve up here, to the U prime 1, they would prefer either the safe job at this higher wage than before, or the riskier job at this much higher wage than either before. So maybe 2 new businesses in town open up. One of them is safe, but it pays more than their old job, and one is risky, that also pays more than the old risky job. The worker in this case would be happy to take either job because they both lie in this higher indifference curve. That means that either option provides more utility than the previous one. Now, we define the worker's reservation price as the amount of money that it would take to get them to switch to the risky job. So here for this initial worker on their original difference curve, the reservation price is the difference between the wage hat one here, what it would take for them to work the risky job, and what it takes for them to work the safe job, W0. So what that means is if the wages rose from W0 to W hat one, that specific worker would not care about the extra risk. They'd be completely indifferent between the two. So it answers that dare you might have received as a kid. How much would it take you to do, this gross thing? In this case, for this worker, how much would it take you to take this riskier job? Well, the difference between W hat one and W0. We can look at the representative individual for our model to understand the worker's thought process. But it's important to note that different workers have different risk profiles. And we're going to talk about this a little bit more later. But just to kind of set it up for you, two of my friends, they're brothers, their older brother opened up a tree trimming business when he got back from serving Afghanistan. After his time in combat, he saw nothing wrong with climbing up trees with a chainsaw in hand because, it was nothing in comparison. I personally wouldn't do that, and I'm sure a lot of you wouldn't be willing to do that. Plenty of my friends from high school weren't even willing to do the furniture factory job that I did. Although I'm sure a big part of that was not wanting to wake up at 5:45 or start work at 5:45. So wake up way before that. So we can draw different indifference curves with different slopes to account for that. Both of my parents are in their late 60s, and they both recently retired. But even if they were still working, neither of them would work a job with any risk of injury right now, no matter how much they paid at this point in their lives. Their indifference curves would look very different from a 20-year-old guy that feels invincible because they have very different levels of risk tolerance. So now let's look at starting to determine the market for compensating differentials. Here we have a supply curve for risky jobs. Before, the y-axis for the supply and demand model was the wage. But notice here, it's not the wage. It's the W1 minus W0. It is the compensating differential for those jobs. So it's the difference between what you would get paid in the safe job versus what you would have to get paid for the risky job. So just a little bit different, although the way we work with it is going to be the same. This model has a slightly different goal. Its purpose is to help us understand the trade-offs between the two types of jobs, the risky jobs and safe jobs. When the difference in the wage between the risky jobs and the safe jobs is 0, that would be down here at this point, no one would be willing to take the risky job. The minimum that anyone in this market is willing to work at is this delta W hat minimum. Basically, it's the difference between these two, so the compensating differential, and the very minimum amount anyone would be willing to switch over from the safe job to the risky job. So this is like the 20-year-old kid that feels invincible, or my friend's older brother, someone who has the greatest risk tolerance of any of the workers in this group. Now, as we move up the labor supply curve here, remember that represents the willingness of each individual to work at that wage. As we move up here, it's increasing the difference in pay between the risky job and the safe job. As the difference increases, more people are, what your textbook says, bought off. They're willing to accept the increased risk as we now start paying them more and more money. So we have more workers being willing to work for this risky job. The more it increases, the more are willing to enter. Now, you may think this is crazy, that you would never accept that kind of risk. But think of a situation where you're offered $1 billion to work a risky job for 1 year. Most people, it would take a disgusting amount of money to actually work such a risky job. It would be so impractical that no one would actually offer it in the real world. But there is some amount of money, some huge amount of money, that it would take to overcome the dislike of risk. So that's represented by way up here on the curve, these super high compensating differentials. But now it takes two to tango, and it takes two sides of the market to reach equilibrium. So let's consider firms. They're going to be the demand curve here, remember. Firms have a choice about the level of safety that they offer or that they require of workers. The firm's choice depends on what level of safety is most profitable. Now, remember, they won't just go to the most lax safety standards possible. They still have to consider the level of risk that workers are willing to put up with. It's a market and there's give or take, just like we saw give or take for the wages. So while firms may prefer offering the cheaper, riskier environment, much like they're willing to pay the lowest possible wage or would prefer to, once we start working through the labor market process and the workers' preferences will force them to meet somewhere in the middle, just like we saw with just plain wages in the past. Now, I'm not going to take you through all the details of the firm's profit function with the cost of safety incorporated, but I do suggest that you read it on your own and get some understanding with it because I think it's important enough for background and you should probably have some of that to help you with this. But I want to focus on a broad takeaway here. And that is that firms have a choice of the level of safety that they provide and require of their workers, but it is costly. They reach their decision on how safe or risky the job should be based on what maximizes their profits. But again, they don't have complete control in setting whatever level they want when there is competition in the labor market. So the compensating wage differentials for a labor market are determined by the interaction of supply and demand. In this case, we see that at point P, this is the equilibrium point. That W1 minus W0 star here, that's the compensating differential. And E star is the number of workers that choose to work in the risky job. The equilibrium wage is positive. That's because workers need compensation for the additional risk. So the compensating differential here is positive, and that's above the wages that they're receiving or that they would receive for the safe job. So what's important to note is that this compensating differential, this is the reservation price for the marginal worker. So it's how much it takes for that last worker to take that job, to bring the market into equilibrium. It doesn't have anything to do with the overall distaste for risk in the entire population. Don't think of this as some sort of average, like we're tempted to. Each worker before the marginal or the last worker in these risky jobs is overcompensated in a way. They're willing to work for this lower compensating differential down here. So they're getting some surplus from it, just like we saw workers receive surplus in the labor market equilibrium before. So they receive more compensation than the added risk that they take on. For this last worker, they are perfectly indifferent. They get just enough to move them into that more risky job. Not all workers have the same tolerance for risk, like I kind of talked about earlier to set this up. Some workers may not dislike risk, like the few examples I gave. The textbook compares these workers to motorcycle riders who don't wear helmets or even long sleeves or leather jackets and zip through traffic, weaving in and out of lanes 100 miles an hour. I'm sure if you've driven on the highway, you've had to deal with people cutting in and out like that. If workers are not simply willing to accept some risk, but they actually enjoy risk, like these people, then they can have a negative reservation wage that you don't have to pay them more than the safe job. In fact, they could pay less than the safe job because these people enjoy some of the risk. So this is basically a supply and demand curve like we saw before, except it's a little bit more extreme. In this case, the left side of the supply curve, these workers are risk loving. They enjoy the risk. So the compensating wage differential right here, W1 minus W0 star, that's negative. Because right here is zero, our x-axis. Normally it's down here because we don't extend the wages into the negative territory. Since we're dealing with compensating differentials, we can do that here. Now, one of the reasons why this looks a little different is because some are willing to accept negative compensating differential, but some are, or I guess the firm only wants some workers, a few workers, a small number of workers. So we have this downward sloping demand curve like normal, but it's extremely steep and it crosses over here in this negative territory. So E star here, this represents the number of workers in the risky jobs in equilibrium. Sorry for the click. And this right here, where it crosses at point P, trace it over here, and that is the negative compensating differential. So the difference between the safe job and the risky job and salary is actually negative, that it's lower wages for the riskier job. So So it may seem like risk-loving workers don't exist, especially because we're thinking about physical injuries here, and that it may be tougher to imagine them. But we can think of another type of risk that makes it a little bit more obvious: entrepreneurs. Some people want the safety and the consistency of working for a large company that they know won't suddenly go out of business and has stable hours, stable paycheck, all of that. Others want the freedom and, frankly, the pressure of being their own boss and running a small company, despite or because of the value that they feel from the risk involved in running it. That's some of that risk. Um, I don't know if any of you watch the TV show or the cartoon Bob's Burgers, where they run a struggling burger restaurant. And part of his joy is running that restaurant, even though there's so much risk. And basically, every episode, they're running out of money. Yeah. Okay. I think, we're getting pretty late, so I'm going to stop here and we will pick up with the hedonic wage theory in next lecture.